How about you guys take that mic and I'll take this one. Well, welcome. We didn't give him a clap. Okay, because it's a husband and wife team, I can't help but ask this question. How did you guys meet?
He wants me to answer this one. Okay. So we were living in Philadelphia. Both came to work at the same church, and through that, that's how we got to know each other. It's a long story, sort of a long story, but that's the summary. You always want to add something. I know.
Is there something more gritty than that, Coz?
No, of course not. No.
How old were you guys?
Mid to late 20s.
Yeah, cool. That's good. Well, we're glad to have you here. You've worked around the world, lots of different ministries. Can you give us a bit of a rundown of what that has looked like?
I had a call to ministry in my second year at uni. And so my ministry has been kind of my life. And also during that time, I went to Southwest Philly. I was in Philadelphia at a school there, but I went to Southwest Philly, which was a completely different demographic than I was born and raised. And then also served in the Dominican Republic, but most of my time has been in Philadelphia. But I was a country girl, so the city was different. Yours is a little more extensive than mine.
Oh, no, it's more extensive. So, yeah, Philadelphia, and then we've done work, both of us done work in Guatemala, done work down in South Africa and in Egypt, but primarily all it's been based out of Philadelphia in that context.
That's great. Joyce, I've been asking this question, but have you had a positive training experience when it comes to training up women? I'm hoping to hear about some women you might have trained up.
Well, actually, my focus was in children's ministry. And so, interestingly enough, the person that stood out to me, I think in that was actually a man, or a boy, or a young man. So we kind of worked together. Coz was focusing on youth and I was focusing on children. And so there was a young man who was just about graduating high school, and we were seeing some real leadership potentials in him. And so he came under me in the children's ministry, and probably 15 years later, he sent me a text message. And in that text message, he referenced something that I had taught him, but now he was in this, one of the largest youth ministry organizations. And he said, look what they're teaching me. They're teaching me something that you taught me like 15 years ago. So that was kind of cool.
What a lovely story.
Yeah, but he's now
he's the head of the largest parachurch youth ministry in Philly. He's trained about 500 youth workers now through his work. So.
Wow, that's pretty cool. That's so good. Coz, can you tell me a little bit more about why you came back to Australia and what you're doing here?
Yeah, so I came back because Joyce wanted to live here. She was pretty clear. She was probably sick of me complaining about America for 28 years. So we came back to work with the Anglican diocese, particularly around what we're calling marginalised communities, although none of the terms are really the greatest. But what's going on in poorer communities. So part-time with Craig in Mount Druitt, and then part-time with the diocese, particularly looking at about 30 communities across the region. So from as far out as Lithgow and down into the Illawarra. And that involves a lot around how do we train people to work in these contexts and communities. So for us, it's probably a little more defined, smaller defined than kind of this larger idea of everyday people. And we're talking about mostly those who are coming from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds.
Okay, we're just about to go for lunch, but when people come back to hear what you've got to say, what are you hoping that they're going to take away?
Yeah, my head keeps bending around some of the topics and some of the things we're talking about. For me, going back to Scripture, that I don't see this distinction in disciples. I don't see that Jesus had like a training program for his higher educated and one for his lower educated. And these distinctions, I think in the US, the distinctions around race primarily. So, we've been working in black and brown context, not in white context. Here is a little bit more around class. But kind of maybe down some of these barriers that Neil so beautifully put in his opening about the assets base of communities. And talking about that's, I think, how we see and how we live. We've been sustained in our lives because of people in poor communities who've taken care of us and continue to take care of us. Two of our girls are still back in Philly, and and then just a friend sent me a letter. He goes, it's my responsibility to take care of your family. Now, he's a guy who came out of, an incredible background, and that's how we've lived. And so, maybe I want to share a bit about that.
Joyce, what about you?
It kind of it's there's a lot that goes into 28 years of living, and the line of ministry. I think Lindy was so beautifully put it. Like, it becomes so much of your life, and just sharing a little bit more stories about that and how that our home was. There, we took in people, so people lived with us from little children to, a retired, woman. And so, we've lived a lot of different experiences. I don't think we have enough time to share all of that, but kind of touch on some of those experiences.
I can't wait to hear you guys. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Hey, we're going to probably be not as well prepared as those who came before, right, with this. In fact, we're going to talk a bit more story stuff. Please stop us at any point if you have any questions or if you don't understand what Joyce is saying with her weird accent. It's really interesting. So we've been married 26 years. I think we work phenomenally as a couple, but not always very well together on things. So we just laughed at this. We're like, this should be interesting. So we work really well when we're like in different spaces. Is that pretty accurate? Yeah, so we'll see how it goes. So let me pray for us and then go. Hey, God, thanks we can be here. Thanks we can get to, discuss your word openly and talk about the things you've done, Lord. And thanks for the amazing things you do. We pray these things in your name, Lord. Amen. I'd say by probably the best piece of advice I ever got in ministry coming into a really challenging context was don't ever take credit for anything that goes well, because you'll never be able to live with the blame for all the things that go poorly. And I want to start with that to say that we're going to share some stories about things that we've seen. Sometimes we've had a role in those. Other times, one of my roles has been an observer and a documenter of great things that God's been doing. But this is just kind of one side of the story, and so please feel free to ask the other side, or don't assume that we're just saying that everything goes well and things go well. So Joyce shared a story about Ness, and it's amazing, but I could tell you stories of 5 of Ness's friends who were murdered in the last 10 years, and I could tell you stories of kids that have been lost and so forth. So I want to say that at first. I think sometimes people think we just talk about all this amazing stuff that happens and don't always share the other side. So I think that's one. I think the other, just as a reflection as we start, and I think this is always a reflection we do in the room, is who's in the room and who's not in the room. And I think just to leave you to think this through as we go is, in the ministries, does your leadership and the leadership around you reflect the community that you work in? And if it doesn't, I think that's probably where we begin as one of the most fundamental issues. And a big part of what we've been about and seen is that the leadership reflects the community and its dynamic. And at least in the denomination we're within, I think that's the biggest gap I've seen anywhere, is the leadership and the communities not reflecting each other. So, everywhere I go in Sydney, people talk about how diverse Sydney is and how mixed it is and how you've got all these new immigrants and so forth, yet that's not usually reflected when I see in leadership of things, not necessarily who's in the pews, but who's in leadership. I think I was going to start trying to think of an analogy of places I feel comfortable. So I grew up mostly in Armidale. I was born in Newcastle and then grew up in Armidale, actually outside Armidale in the bush. Ended up living in housing commission after my mum and I guess, were homeless for a year, and so we lived in government housing, and then I left to the US when I was 22 when I became a Christian. But I'm a big rugby league fan. And I was thinking the other day the differences sometimes between the classes we have here. So I was at the Eels game, which is, of course, the only team to really support. I'm a member. So I was at the Eels game on Thursday night. And then last night we went, and Joyce went to 2 football games in a row. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
We went to the Roosters game, opening the new stadium. My brother-in-law had tickets, and so he took us. And I was reflecting on the crowds, and it was fascinating. The Eels crowd reflected the western suburbs. You felt like you had working class people coming in, watching the game, everything good. And then you go to the Roosters one, and I felt like I was in the eastern suburbs. The Eels game was indicative of that, indicative of understanding the game and understanding what was going on. And so people were respectful. They were looking out for each other. They were, there's a guy behind us who was giving it to the ref the whole time, using foul language, but he'd stop and just make sure that he wasn't offending the women in front of us, right? And people sat down and watched the game. And then last night, the Roosters was probably the worst experience I've had in a stadium, where people just couldn't sit still. They just had to get up and do something else and go here and go here. And I was like, you're not here for the game, right? You're here for something else. You don't get the game. And I think often that's in our context and communities, when the leadership doesn't reflect the community in context, they don't get the game. They don't get what it's all about. They're running something else. And so last night's game was like being at a hipster function at a bar. It had nothing to do with the actual game. So I just had to take some jabs at the Roosters. I think I'm working off some questions that were asked and want to try and touch on these things. I think an early question was, who did we train when we're doing ministry? So both of us have got training backgrounds and done quite a lot of training. What kinds of people did we train? We train people from the community because that's who's there. And so we're coming out of a context where people in the community ran the churches in the communities. To give you some context on Philly, so Philly is the poorest of America's major cities. It went through a massive white flight so as African Americans were allowed to move from the south into the northeast, the white population left the inner cities, and the churches were one of the leaders of that. So the Christian institutions left the inner city areas as the black population moved in. So Philly's been the poorest, so massive dilapidation, tens of thousands of abandoned houses, hundreds of abandoned factories through the city. Our community was the poorest of Philadelphia's, so it would be considered the most marginalized community in any major city in the US, and absolutely thriving with the gospel. And my experience in seeing around the world, including in places that people say the gospel is so hard to do, places like Egypt, we've seen thriving ministry take place when local people are doing their ministry. So, that's who our experience has been in training is local people from the context. I think we talked about, a question was, how do we train? I think Joyce might talk a little bit about from some of the children's ministry and training methodologies used.
Yeah, so I was a school teacher from uni, and I moved into this neighborhood, but I was an outsider. I grew up in the country, and so, Philadelphia was very different from where I grew up. And being an outsider, I think it was a very interesting experience for me as I moved into Philadelphia. Well, before I actually started doing the ministry, I was just a student coming in every Sunday, ran the programs, and I would leave. And then after I graduated, God called me to come in, and I lived there. And so I went through these stages of coming in, going out, coming in, living there. So that was like another step of trust that was built in the community. And then there was a family that I had worked with whose mother had an alcohol and drug addiction. She went to a rehab, and her children came to live with me. And so the community saw me taking in their kids. And so then another layer of trust was built in the community. And so as Coz said, just really believing and living where we were working and building that trust. So our focus was on the people that lived there and observing the gifts that the people in the community had, as was mentioned, and how can we use those gifts in our ministry. And there's always many needs in children's ministry. And so we took, this is one of the threads that have been woven throughout today that we didn't talk about it and plan, but the approach that we ended up taking was more of an apprentice-based approach, because it's very intimidating for people to say, oh, I need you as a teacher. That word teacher is very intimidating. Or I need you as a leader. That word is very intimidating. But they're doing it in small ways, in different ways. And so I would invite them to come into the classroom and just kind of help out. And we would start talking, just kind of discussing what happened in that day, and weave in the, how you teach a lesson and things like that. But it was very much an apprentice-based come in and work alongside of me and others that were working. Yeah.
Yeah, so using that, so removing some of those barriers that others might feel, right? So as Joyce said, like the concept of saying, well, here's a book, go read it and learn how to be a teacher, or come and take our class on being a teacher, actually embedding in the work, or is weird terminology like incarnational ministry, which is what all my ministry experience was called incarnational. Every so often I hear some critique of it. I never understood what any critique could be on being incarnational, but that's our... that would be the basis, like move alongside and work with people. This question of kind of what are some challenges in training, or challenges with things we've seen. I think it's the barriers that are put up by one group who doesn't understand the context that the other group's in is the primary barrier. And it's fascinating how I think middle-class Christians are pretty good at putting up barriers for others in other ways. Actually, I think we see that really well in global missions and dynamics and how money is allocated and so forth. But I was thinking of a story, and I want to think about, he's not a young friend of ours anymore, but he was a young friend when I met him, friend Tony. I met Tony when he was about 13 or 14, came from a very complex family situation, so single mum, 5 kids in the house, lived in a little apartment above a TV repair store. I remember going in the middle of winter. Philadelphia has very cold winters, and they didn't have any heat in the house. And I was kind of thinking, I can't see Tony's trajectory out of this situation. I just can't see what could we do to change Tony's situation. And I had phenomenal mentoring. Almost all my mentoring was coming from African American and Latino men and women who grew up in those contexts. And they'd constantly push and say, "Coz, you've got to see differently. You can't see through your lens. You have to see through the lens of the context, the community, the lens that's coming from there," which means that you've got to strip away what you think a leader is and begin to look at what the community sees as a leader, and particularly look at what God sees as a leader, and constantly going back to the scriptures and saying, what are the leaders? Like, did Jesus call the disciples and say, I've got to send you away for 3 years of Bible college, and when you get finished Bible college, why don't you come back and we'll start doing ministry together? Right, so none of this stuff existed in the scriptures, and so we're kind of going back to what happened. And so we began working with Tony and being part of his life, and he ended up, when he finished high school, most of the kids we worked with didn't finish high school, Tony finished, was working a job as a contractor and began looking at something else, and I was on the board of a health clinic, and our health clinic is quite sizable, about 250 staff now. At that time, we probably had about 100 staff, pretty significant budget, and we're looking for a site director for a new place, and I was like, I think we've got this guy, Tony. And they said, well, but Tony's never been to university, and the job requires somebody who went to university. I said, why? And they said, we're not sure. But all our managers went to university. In fact, in every job description we have, you had to have had a university degree. I said, well, I get that for a doctor, because we're talking about a professional qualification that government approves. I get that for a nurse. But what about for a site manager? And I said, well, let's go through what we need in a site manager. We need somebody who understands the community. We need somebody who speaks the language. We need somebody who understands the cultural dynamics. We need somebody who can sort through the complex situations. I said, where in that doesn't Tony meet the requirements? I said, he meets every requirement. I said, all right, let's have a look at some of these candidates who have degrees. Let's see what their qualifications are. And none of them measured up to Tony. And what we found is that somewhere along the lines we just put in as qualification is you should have gone to uni, but not actually testing what the ability of the person was. And there was a significant debate, especially from those who had the higher qualifications, who said, well, we need somebody who went to uni. But no one could justify what university would have taught him that the community didn't teach him. In fact, we knew the community taught him more in his success. And so he was the first risk that the health clinic took, to say, we're going to hire somebody who doesn't have a degree. And it opened up the doors. And so all job descriptions, other than obviously our doctors and nurses, were then changed to say a bachelor's degree or equivalency. And that changed the dynamics. And the clinic then continued to grow. And if you went in there, you'd say that the strength of the clinic was people who came from the local context, who didn't go to university, but who were dynamic in running the areas within the place. And then sometimes people from outside will say, well, you need people with higher education, right? You need people with these degrees. You need people with these things to run an organization, to be in charge. Well, our clinic is a fascinating thing in the US. It's designed to give healthcare to those who don't have insurance, which is a significant group in poor communities. And there's a mandate on that half of our board members have to be patients of our clinic. Now, our clinic serves the poorest group in the city, which means that half of our board has to be representative of the poor. Our board needs to represent our patients. So our board members is made up of single mothers, pensioners, people on welfare, we have members who have HIV positive, because we have a significant section that we deal with people HIV positive. That's the board members of our organisation. Now, they oversee, I think we just approved the budget, about a $50 million a year budget. People say, how can you have poor people overseeing $50 million a year budget? We just finished a $40 million brand new building without financing. How can poor people oversee that kind of a thing? And we say, well, we have staff who have expertise in how to make a decision work, but the board needs to dictate what we want to do. And this is where it's often get mixed up in the churches, and I think in mixed up in what does, is where does the power lie? And so I say, like, our board might come in and say, look, my neighbour couldn't get access to the clinic this week. Figure out what to do, right? And then we have experts who can figure out how to get better access to the clinic. But they work for us as a board. They're not in charge of the board. It flips that power dynamic around, and those in power obviously don't like when they lose the power, right? They don't like that flip. But that's what made it so effective, and that's what makes it such a driven organisation, and was a big part of what grew us to the largest ministry in the city, was because the power begins to lie in the hands of the community, not in the hands of the experts and outsiders. And we see that in churches often, where it's who makes the decisions on how the money gets spent. It tends to be those who come from wealthier backgrounds in the church. Who makes the decisions on what programs are going to be offered? It tends to be those with the higher education. Rather than using those people to facilitate the decisions that the community has made. And by community, I mean the believers in the community who come from that community. If that's making sense. So it kind of flips things around. And so we've seen incredible success when local people run local ministries. And I think we've seen that expanded across that most of the data that we've seen, in fact, all the data I've seen, but I'll just say most because maybe there's something else, is that in the US and in similar places, the church growth currently is happening in poor communities and happening in non-white communities. So white evangelical America is in fairly rapid decline, but non-white Christianity is growing and growing very well, and it's growing out of poor communities. Is there anything to add? On who you saw? I think we have a question of why do we want to train? No, why do you want to train people? Why did you like to train people?
Doesn't that lead it to the other question?
You can.
So training myself out of a job, I did not go into this church to continue running the children's ministry. I wanted to see someone who really like lived there, really knows the people, knows how to engage better than I do, the local people. So I wanted to train and equip Tina to take over the children's ministry one day. And so my investment was in her, and because she was from the community. And yeah, that was what ended up happening. After Coz and I were called to another church, she took over from what I was doing.
I get motivated by justice issues. Like, I think Scripture is so much about justice, and that's the lens I read it through. So I'm always reading Jesus where he's taking shots at the rich and taking care of the poor. Like, so that's my bent, and I'm quite biased in that. But also I probably live with this idea of a bit of a chip on the shoulder concept. So coming from Armidale, where there's only now one public school, but there was 2 public schools and 4 private schools, 3 of which are high-class private. My family were school teachers, and so I was always taught to hate private school people, never talk to them, never have anything to do with them. That's why we're rugby league fans. So having some of those things, so I never did well when I felt like I was denied opportunity or looked down on. And we often felt that, right? We were looked down on because we went to the public schools. So I was quite good academically, and then once my parents divorced, and for me school didn't matter too much, and so I really bombed out year 11 and year 12, and my mum and I moved 6 times in year 11. So I got into uni, dropped out of uni. Uni didn't make sense to me, so I was first semester dropout. When I got to the US, I applied for Bible colleges because now I'm a Christian. I want to go to seminary, and no one would take me because I didn't have a bachelor's degree. And I would say, why does it matter? And they said, well, that's our qualification. You have to have a bachelor's degree in order to study theology. So this would go a few years, and every few years I'd apply to a few more seminaries, and every few years I'd get rejected by seminaries. And remember, I'd been in full-time ministry for about 10 years, running local ministry, and I was sitting with a group of guys who were actually pastors of churches, and none of us could get into a seminary. And we're like, this is stupid. Like, these people are coming out of seminaries with no idea how to do ministry into our context, and we're not allowed to go. And so a friend of ours who created a Bible college, he said, I'm going to get you guys through what we call a bootleg program, a backdoor into this thing. And I remember sitting in my first class. I hated it. I couldn't understand why we had to do this stuff. And a good friend of mine, Doug Logan, he goes, Coz, some of us have to survive this system if we're going to change this system. It's a justice issue. Now, Doug now heads probably the fastest growing seminary in the United States. He's the vice president of Acts 29. He survived the system enough to change the system. And that for me was the motivation of teaching, is I wanted to remove all these barriers that people had put up that didn't make any sense from the gospel perspective of why we could or couldn't train. It had nothing to do with whether we were called, had nothing to do with whether we had the ability. It was all based upon some other factor. And so everything from then on, working-wise and designing, was to say, how do we just keep removing barriers that stop people getting into the field? And I believe, and so I'm new enough back, I'm not a Sydney person, I'm new enough back to the context to not know if this is correct, but based on everywhere else I've been in the world, I believe God raises up people from all kinds of communities. And I certainly can't see anywhere in Scripture where God favors the wealthy. I don't see it in Scripture. And I particularly don't see it in the New Testament that God ever says, I favor the wealthy, so I'm going to put the wealthy in charge of everything. I think James has a lot to say about that, about how we tend to favor the wealthy and how wrong we are to do that. So if God doesn't favor the wealthy, if God isn't racist, and I don't think God is racist, then when we look at a situation and say that we're so skewed towards one group, then it becomes for me a systemic issue. It's not the people, it's the system. So I believe that our communities are full of people who God has wanted to see raised up to be leaders, and our systems just haven't worked for them to be raised up in that way. So I think some is giving credit to what's out there already, and giving credit to the churches that no one often wants to talk about, the small independent ones. I laughed the other day, I met a young Filipino youth worker. He came to my house, I live in a rectory, and he's like, why is there a plaque on your wall that says, like, this belongs to the church? I said, yeah, this is a rectory. He goes, what is that? I said, oh, rectories, the church gives us a house. He goes, really? A church gives you a house? Like, how great is that? I said, I don't know. And then we start talking bivocational, people who, and he goes, what's bivocational? I said, well, that's a pastor who, pastors part-time and works another job to pay for it. And he goes, you mean like every Filipino pastor I've ever met in my life? I was like, yeah, just like them. It's embedded in other cultures and systems, and so often we don't give credit to that. And I think that's one of the early things is we give credit. And that was part in Philly, is giving credit to what God's doing. Another is saying, be able to help people identify their skills and saying, look, we're going to help you remove the barriers to this. As Neil just beautifully began with, right, an asset-based approach, which is the thing. We look at the assets of the community. Now, for Joyce and I, it's probably been a little bit easier because we were dropped, both of us came into communities where we needed the community to survive, and quite literally, right? I mean, I was 10,000 miles away from where I came from. The only way I could survive in that context was for local people to look after us. If local people didn't look after us, it just wouldn't work. And David mentioned a case over here of when he was in a community and somebody effectively gave him permission to walk around that community. We survived in our community because of that. We came out of a high violence community, the highest murder rate in the country at the moment. You can't move through the community unless the community gives you permission. And all our girls' lives growing up, we've got a son as well, but our girls are a bit older, and I'd always say to them, look, don't get into trouble and don't get anybody else into trouble because one of your uncles will kill somebody. And they say, oh, Dad, that's really funny. And then they got older, they're like, oh, you really meant that, didn't you? Like, I was like, yeah, your uncles would literally kill somebody if they touched you. That's the protection the community gives. So very easy for my kids to see that strength and see that life because it was a community that took care of them and protected them and kept them going along. But I wanted to leave you a quote this morning. It came in providentially. I wrote to a friend of mine who's a New Testament scholar, and we've debated for years on some of these issues, but he's a brilliant scholar and an author. And I asked him a question about the languages that the New Testament was written in this idea of education. And he wrote back to me this morning, about a month late, but we'll let him off. And this is part of his quote. He says, the church fathers had to defend the New Testament style from the ridicule of skeptics. And here's an interesting quote. This is from another guy, from a grammar he's been reading recently. The authors of the New Testament consistently demonstrate considerable literacy skills and use their Greek with absolute confidence, even though that Greek did not meet the requirements of the educated upper class. The Greek that the New Testament guys did not meet the requirements of the educated upper class. The church fathers, therefore, spoke of sermo humilis, of the simple, lowly style of the New Testament, at the same time understanding humilis in the sense of humble. The perspective could encourage pastors that even if they're not educated in the elite institutes of society, they can still learn and be confident in their understanding of the scriptures in the church. That the things that we're talking about today in these debates were the same things that were happening in the first century, that the first century authors were being put down because they didn't come from the high education institutes and they didn't use the proper high Greek. So I found that very encouraging, and maybe encouraging for all of us to think, we've got many who've come before us in the same battle. So, thanks, John.